Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. This is the main reason why we're here. Richard Fisher, he's the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. I told him I'd be very brief because you want to hear what he has to say. There is cards around your table. If you got any questions, try to get them up to me, and we'll be asking him those questions. But Mr. Fisher assumed the office of President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas back in April of 2005. In this role, Fisher serves as a member of the Federal Open Market Committee, the Federal Reserve's principal monetary policy group. So, Mr. Fisher, be interested to hear what you have to say.
Too long an introduction. Before we get started, where's our harpist? Gosh, she went up to the heavens. Anyway, that wonderful woman's from Booker T. Washington, a high school student. Let's give her a round of applause. And even though as a government official, quasi-government official as it were, I am not supposed to talk about religion anywhere, let me just say that if you don't believe in angels and you were listening to Miss Wilson sing, then you're from another universe. I mean, that woman has the voice of an angel, and I want to thank you for that beautiful song. I want to thank you all for inviting me to speak this morning. I want to thank Dennis and all the other hosts invited me to come speak here to the Dallas-Fort Worth Minority Suppliers Development Council. Several of my employees are here with me. I'm going to just quickly ask them to stand up. Harvey Mitchell, who's the Vice President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, Al Qualman, our Operations Officer, Nissa Hadi, who is our Office of Women and Minority Affairs Analyst, Tyrone Golson, who, frankly, I work for. He runs everything. Dana Merritt, Assistant Vice President, Sherry Gavin, Vice President, and Claude Davis, Assistant Vice President, and Sandra Davis. Thank you for being here. We run a $111 billion bank. People forget not just that we're on the Open Market Committee, but that we actually operate the largest bank in this part of the country. To make it possible for you to have spending money, folding money, cash, 2/3 of that of the United States is printed in Fort Worth, Texas. We distribute it through the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. We order, along with the 11 other Federal Reserve banks, the amount of folding money that you need in your pocket. And we also clear checks to the extent they still exist. Rather, young people don't use checks anymore. Young girls like you don't use checks anymore. We used to have 40 some odd processing centers in the Federal Reserve System. We concentrated all the paper checks to Cleveland. We figured we lost LeBron James, they have nothing else, we're going to give them checks. So that's what they do. And of course we supervise and regulate banks, conduct research, and make the payment system of the United States work. So that's the business side of our business. We have been actively involved in the Dallas-Fort Worth Minority Suppliers Development Council for numbers of years. Our staff first met President Margot Posey in 2005 at the Houston Minority Supplier Development Council. And since that fateful meeting, we've participated in a number of the DFW, I'm going to use the acronym, it's easier, MSDC events, including Procurement Connection Regional Seminar, the Doing Business Texas Style, Spot Bid Fair, and the Access Expo, Making Valuable Business Connections. In March of this year, Margot was guest panelist at the first annual, and I stress annual because this is the first of what we hope will be an annual fair, Small Business Supplier Fair at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, what we call Partnership with Procurement, which provided information on the council and to encourage suppliers to become certified minority business enterprise suppliers. As a result of this relationship, we have sourced suppliers from DFWMSDC for a number of recent projects at the Dallas Fed. We expect to continue to do so, and with that as background, I just want to thank you for having me here today. I'm very proud to be here with you today. A few weeks ago, I was in Washington. I survived. No. And there I had breakfast with an old worldly wise friend from my old days when I served as a trade negotiator in the United States and as an ambassador. His name is Mike Moore. He's a former Prime Minister of New Zealand, former head of the World Trade Organization. and now is New Zealand's ambassador to Washington. Ambassador Moore's perspectives are different than mine, but I always find him very thought-provoking. He's blessed with a keen mind and an ability to deploy a very pungent sense of humor, and usually wrapping something in a memorable analogy in order to convey a very serious message. And he told me the story of a God-fearing man who prayed several times a day, imploring the Lord to let him win the lottery. So day after day, year after year, decade after decade, the Lord listened to this man, and finally he grew weary of this man's prayers, and he spoke to him. And he said, "Son, help me out. Buy a lottery ticket." Well, this morning I'm going to make reference to the Federal Reserve and the job of central banker. This is what I do for a living. It's my colleagues and I do for a living. It's reflexive of me to explain my and my colleagues' calling. Margot and Dennis and Bob Marwill, who gave a great invocation, have asked me to broaden my theme, however, and I'm going to do just that. You asked for a call to action. I'm going to suggest that our nation has a crying need for public leadership to correct what's wrong with our economy. I'm going to suggest that what I do for a living, my colleagues do for a living, monetary policy, cannot do it alone. It must be complemented by responsible fiscal policy, policy that's exclusively the responsibility of those we elect and send to Washington to vote our interests as a people. I'm going to suggest that rather than posturing for political expediency and positioning for victory at the polls in November of 2012, our nation's political leaders need to actually now buy a ticket, put themselves at risk right now without delay. Each passing day that they fail to do so, they further jeopardize our economic stability and our great nation's future. 3.5 years ago, I gave a speech to the Commonwealth Club of California. And in that speech, I warned of what I called a frightful storm brewing in the form of untethered government debt. I chose then the words frightful storm because central bankers are not given to hyperbole and exaggeration. I wanted to modestly state the problem. I warned then that unless we take steps to deal with it, the long-term fiscal situation of our federal government would be unimaginably more devastating to our economic prosperity than the recent financial crisis that we have yet to fully recover from. Now, you might wonder why a Federal Reserve official, policymaker, why a central banker would be concerned with fiscal matters. Fiscal policy, after all, is, as I said earlier, the responsibility of Congress. It's not the responsibility of the Federal Reserve. Congress, and Congress alone, has the power to tax our money and spend. From this monetary policy maker's point of view, though, deficits matter for what we do at the Fed and at the central bank. And there are many reasons why. Economists have found that structural deficits raise long-term interest rates. They complicate the Fed's dual mandate to develop a monetary policy that promotes sustainable, non-inflationary employment growth. That's what we're charged with doing. The even more disturbing, dark, and dirty secret about deficits, especially when they careen out of control, is that they create political pressure on the Federal Reserve and on central banks to adopt looser monetary policy down the road. I'm going to return to that shortly, but first let me give you some of the unvarnished facts about our nation's fiscal predicament. Over a decade ago, our federal budget, crafted, I want to remind you, by a Democratic president, enacted by a Republican Congress, produced a fiscal surplus of $236 billion, the first surplus in almost 40 years, and the highest nominal dollar surplus in American history. While the Fed is scrupulously nonpartisan and non-political, I mention this to emphasize that the deficit debt issue knows no party and can be solved only by both parties working together. For a brief time, with surpluses projected into the future as far as the eye could see back then, economists and policymakers alike began to contemplate what I call a bucolic future, in which interest payments would form an ever-declining share of federal outlays, and a future where Treasury bonds and debt ceiling legislation would become dusty relics of a long-forgotten past. You may remember that the financial press and the Federal Reserve even had concerns about how open market operations could be conducted at that time with that projection in a marketplace where Treasury debt didn't exist or was fastly disappearing. Well, we know now that that utopian scenario did not last for long. Our nation's budget deficit has soared. In 2009, it was $1.4 trillion. It's expected to remain above $1 trillion annually until at least 2013. Since the beginning of the last decade, federal government spending has grown from 18% of gross domestic product to 24% today. And if the present trends continue, according to the Congressional Budget Office, which is also nonpartisan and neutral and highly respected, it would rise to 34% over the next 25 years and remain above 1/3 of our economy in perpetuity. Over the same period, receipts, that is what they take in from taxes, would rise by only 3 percentage points. What's wrong with this picture? An economist at Dallas Fed, Jason Saving, will be discussing this. This is an advertisement in our upcoming economic letter. I urge you all to look at it. And he's going to point out that outlays, that is what our federal officials spend, as a share of our nation's economy, have now reached a 65-year high, while revenue stands at a 70-year low. Of course, part of this is a result of our nation's current economic woes and a slow economy. But an examination of that recent revenue and expenditure trends provides evidence that both lower tax rates and new spending programs have both played an important role in creating the fiscal situation in which we now find ourselves. How do recent budgetary developments in Washington change our fiscal outlook? Good question. I'm glad I asked it of myself, so I can explain it to you. As with most budget projections, it depends upon the assumptions that one is willing to make. The first framework assumes that Congress does not change anything that is scheduled to occur under the current law. That means, among other things, that the 2001-2003 tax cuts expire on schedule in 2013. The alternative minimum tax patch, as they call it, permanently expires at the end of this year. And Medicare reimbursement rates for doctors and hospitals are allowed to fall by 30% next year in line with the so-called sustainable growth rate formula. If all these things happen, all those things happen, and no new programs or tax cuts are introduced, then budget deficits stabilize at about 1.5%, 1.5% of GDP by the end of the decade, with the country's total debt rising by about $3.5 trillion over the decade. The second framework assumes what they call an alternate fiscal scenario, in quotes, under which Congress continues these things at their current rates. The Bush tax cuts are extended, the AMT, alternative minimum tax, continues to be patched, and Medicare reimbursement rates remain essentially at current levels. Under this alternative fiscal scenario, which many observers regard as more realistic, budget deficits fall below 3%, never fall below 3%, and they reach 4.5% of gross domestic product by the end of the decade, and they add a cumulative $8.5 trillion in debt. In an odd way, these dueling projections may be regarded as good news because they highlight the extent to which future deficits are a choice rather than an inevitability. But they also highlight the cost of certain policy choices we as a nation will consider making over the next few years, and the need to either offset those choices with further deficit reduction or else accept that deficits will not fall below 3% of our gross domestic product. That's the rate at which most economists deem to be sustainable in the near future. Now, doing deficit math is a sobering, if not depressing, exercise. It becomes a painful one when you apply your calculator to the long-run fiscal challenge posed by entitlement programs. Were I not a taciturn central banker, I'd say that the mathematics of the long-term outlook for entitlements left unchanged is nothing short of catastrophic. Typically, critics ranging from the Concord Coalition to our own Ross Perot here in Dallas begin by wringing their collective hands over the unfunded liabilities of Social Security. A little history gives you a view as to why. The great Franklin Roosevelt originally conceived a Social Security system in which individuals would fund their own retirements through payroll tax contributions. But Congress quickly realized that such a system would not put much money into the pockets of indigent elderly citizens then ravaged by the Great Depression. Indeed, a pay-as-you-go funding system was embraced, making each generation's retirement the responsibility of its children. Now, fast forward 70 or so years ago and ask this question. What's the mathematical predicament today of the way Social Security is administered? And the answer is the amount of money the Social Security system would need today to cover all the unfunded liabilities or promises made to the American people that have to be fulfilled unless things are changed, what fiscal economists call over the infinite discounted horizon. The value today of what's already been promised recipients, we paid it off today, is $17.9 trillion. That's 20% greater than the annual production of our country. Demographics explain why this is so. Birth rates have fallen dramatically, reducing the worker-retiree ratio and leaving today's workers pulling a bigger load than the system designers ever imagined. Lifespans have lengthened with a corresponding increase in the retirement age, leaving retirees in a position to receive benefits for longer than the system designers ever envisioned. And formulae for benefits and cost of living adjustments have also contributed to that growth in unfunded liabilities. The good news is that the Social Security shortfall is manageable. While the issues regarding Social Security reform are extremely complex, it's at least possible to imagine how Congress might find, if they put their shoulder to the wheel, within a $15 trillion economy, ways to wrestle with a $17.9 trillion unfunded liability. The bad news is that Social Security is the lesser of our worries, of our entitlement worries. It's just the tip of an unfunded liability iceberg. The much bigger concern is Medicare, a program that was established in 1965. Medicare was a pay-as-you-go program from the very beginning. Despite warnings from some congressional leaders, forgive me, some of you are old enough to remember one of them. His name was Wilbur Mills. He had a pay-as-you-go relationship with a woman called the Argentine Firecracker, but that's different. Congressional leaders who foresaw some of the long-term fiscal issues such as financing could pose. And unfortunately, they were right. According to official figures, if you want to cover the unfunded liability of Medicare today, pay it off, it would take $38.4 trillion. Our estimate at the Dallas Fed is twice that level. We estimate that the present value of the unfunded liabilities of Medicare is $76 trillion. That's 5 times the output of our entire economy each year. Why is this figure so large? Why is the Medicare figure so large? Well, there are a mix of reasons, really. In part, it's due to the same birth rate and life expectancy issues that affect Social Security. In part, it's due to ever costlier advances in Medicare medical technology and the willingness of Medicare to pay for them. And in part, it's due to expanded benefits, like the new prescription drug benefit, which within 18 months became a bigger liability than all of Social Security. And that was passed by a Republican president who we know and love, who lives in this town, but I won't mention his name, and by a Democratic Congress. So you add together the unfunded liabilities of Medicare and Social Security, and it comes to, at a minimum, $56 trillion over an infinite horizon, and under our numbers, almost $100 trillion. I want to remind you, I'm only talking about the unfunded portions of Social Security and Medicare. It's what the current payment scheme of Social Security payroll taxes, Medicare payroll taxes, membership fees for Medicare B, and copays and deductibles, and all the other revenue currently channeled to our entitlement system will not cover under the current rules. These existing revenue streams must remain in place in perpetuity to handle the funded entitlement liabilities. Reduce or eliminate this income, and the unfunded liability grows. Increase benefits, and the liability grows as well. So let's say that you and I, as U.S. citizens, decide to fully address this unfunded liability through a lump sum payment from our own pocketbooks, so that all of us and all future generations could be secure, so our children could be secure, and our children's children could be secure, in the knowledge that we and they would receive the benefits that have been promised to us in perpetuity. How much would we have to individually pay if we split the tab? Again, the math is painful. We have a total population of some 309 million citizens, from infants to the elderly. And if you do the math, the per person payment to the federal treasury from each of us and each of our children, each of our grandchildren, each of our great-grandchildren would come to $182,200 apiece. This comes to $725,000 for a family of 4. That's 15 times the average annual income of your typical American family. If these amounts seem draconian, it's because they are draconian. But they do serve to give us a sense of the severity of the problem. And someone must pay. For the existing unfunded liabilities to be covered in the end, someone must pay at a minimum $56 trillion or more, or receive $56 trillion less than had been currently promised by the Congress of the United States. This is a cold, hard fact. The decision we must make is whether to shoulder a substantial portion of that burden today or compel successor generations of Americans to bear its full weight. Well, now that you're thoroughly depressed in this holiday season, let me discuss very briefly monetary policy in the Fed. I just thought I'd cheer you up, with a little lead in there. It's only natural to cast about for a solution, any solution, to avoid the fiscal pain we know that is necessary because we succumb to the complacency and putting off dealing with this looming fiscal disaster. Throughout history, many nations, when confronted by sizable debts they're unable or unwilling to pay, have seized upon the apparently painless solution to this dilemma. Turn to your favorite central bank and have them monetize the debt. Just have that monetary authority run cash off the printing presses until the debt's repaid. That's the way the story goes. And then promise to be responsible from that point on and hope your sins will be forgiven by God or Milton Friedman or whoever you worship. We know from centuries of evidence, going back to ancient Rome, right up to today's Zimbabwe and Kenya, that running the printing presses to pay off today's bills lead to much worse problems later on. It results in inflation. An inflation that results from the flood of money into the economy turns out to be far worse, more devastating, more hurtful to the poor as well as the rich, to the business women and men, to those that live on fixed incomes, than any fiscal pain that they might have hoped to avoid. The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate given to us by the Congress. Our job is to manage growth and inflation. In the long run, growth cannot be sustained if markets are undermined by price instability. Stable prices go hand in hand with achieving sustainable economic growth. I've said many, many times that inflation is a sinister beast that, if uncaged, devours savings, erodes consumers' purchasing power, decimates returns on capital, undermines the reliability of financial accounting, distracts the attention of corporate management, undercuts employment growth and real wages, and debases the currency. We don't want it. Purging rampant inflation and a debased currency requires administering very harsh medicine. We've been there. And we know the cure that was wrought by the Federal Reserve under the leadership of a man named Paul Volcker in the late 70s, early 80s, all the way through the 80s. We know how painful that is. Even the perception that my colleagues and I might be pursuing a cheap money strategy to accommodate fiscal burdens, should that perception take root, is a paramount risk to the long-term welfare of our people. We will never let this happen with the Federal Reserve. Never. It's not an option. It's not going to happen. The way we resolve these liabilities, and resolve them we must, will affect our own well-being as well as the prospects of future generations in the global economy. Failing to face up to our responsibility will produce the mother of all financial storms. The warning signs have been flashing for years. They've been intensified recently by what we're seeing in Europe. There's a lesson there, what we're seeing in Greece and what we're seeing in Rome. But we somehow find it easier to ignore them than to take action. Will we take painful fiscal steps necessary to prevent the storm by reducing or eventually eliminating our fiscal imbalances? Well, that depends on you. And I mean you literally. This is a situation of your own creation. When you berate your congressmen or your senators or your presidents for the mess we're in, you're really berating yourself. You elect them, you put them there, you're the ones who let them get away with burdening our children and grandchildren and their grandchildren, rather than facing up to the bills of our entitlement programs and their fiscal fecklessness. This issue transcends political affiliation. When George Shultz, who's one of our nation's greatest Republican public servants, was director of President Nixon's Office of Management and Budget, he became worried about the amount of money that Congress was proposing to spend. And imagine, back then these were tiny little numbers compared to what we have today. So after some tossing and turning, and he called a legendary staffer, a man named Sam Cohen, into his office. Sam Cohen had an encyclopedic memory of budgetary matters of the United States. He knew every zig and zag in the budget and in our history. And so Mr. Schultz said, "Mr. Cohen, tell me something. Just between you and me, we're in the dark of the night, we're sitting here in the White House, we're serving a Republican president, but is there really any difference between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to spending money?" Now, Mr. Cohen was a thoughtful man. He asked to think about it overnight. And he came back the next morning, and here's his reply. "Mr. Schultz, there's only one difference. Democrats enjoy it more." Well, I don't think that's the case anymore. Both Democrats and Republicans, D's and R's alike, have dug an almost impossible fiscal hole in which they are burying our children's future. Nobody, Democrat or Republican, enjoys placing our children and grandchildren and their children and grandchildren in harm's way. Nobody, regardless of their political affiliation, wants to see the frightful storm of unfunded long-term liabilities destroy our economy, or threaten the independence and authority of our central bank, or tear our currency asunder. Now, lest you think I'm just one more central bank sourpuss, because we're viewed as not very happy people where I work, I should tell you that I'm actually encouraged from what we see in the public, from the Tea Party to the unemployed and the disaffected that have taken to the streets, because I think they're focusing the politicians to concentrate on the dire need to get their act together. I don't know if you saw it yesterday or not, but the favorable rating of Congress is 9%. And as one senator said, that's because that 9% is composed of our families and our staff. Now, I refuse to yield to pessimism, even when it becomes fashionable to do so. Why? Because I am the child of immigrants. My parents came to this country because there was no limit to upward mobility. They came here with nothing. They came to the United States because it's the land of milk and honey. It still is. But it's up to you as the electors of our fiscal authorities to use your power to prevent the destruction which I spoke, and I ask you to do so. I go back to two thoughts. I had mentioned at the very beginning of this talk my friend Mike Moore from New Zealand. He has a book he recently wrote. I found the dedication interesting. It was dedicated to the, quote, honorable public servants elected or otherwise. And then he followed it with a quote from Martin Luther King in terms of what their duties are. And here's the quote from Dr. King. "Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it right? There comes a time," Dr. King said, "when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but one must take it because one's conscience tells them it is right." End of quote. And I would suggest to you that that time is now. We had a beautiful invocation that Bob gave us. I'm going to just close with that part of that invocation I found the most inspiring. He prayed that the Lord would transform our political divisions through the gifts of honor and integrity and a yearning for common boundaries as brothers and sisters, that we would shape the leaders of this land, as you said, into humble servants, to replace the arrogance of power with a sense of service. The power to get them to shape their arrogance into a sense of service is in your hands, and I ask that you exercise it. Thank you. Thanks. Okay. Thank Thank you very much.
We just have a couple questions. Surprisingly, he sounds just as frustrated as we are. And I think a lot of the questions that I had in these cards, he's basically already answered. But one question, he did mention about what can we do, is really kind of maybe a question for him as a business community. We do send our representative up to Congress where we're not getting any action. What else can we do? As a business community, what can we do to help the process?
Well, we live in a democracy. You have a voice. You can exercise your vote. You can talk in the most blunt terms to the people that we elect to represent us. I do believe these people want to do right. I don't care, again, I'm indifferent to party because I think both parties have treated us badly. But I think both parties have the potential to treat us well. And I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican, you can't have programs that you don't think about the consequences of long term and that you have paid for. So I would urge you to express your views. You can write to newspapers, you can talk to radios in the old world, and you can blog, and you can Twitter, and do all the things that you and I know so well because we're so young. And you can lobby as citizens, not through organized groups. Just make your message known. Again, nobody wants to be unpopular. I know because we're pretty unpopular at the Fed. It's not very pleasant. But no one wants to be 9% favored. They'd like the people to love them. You give them hard love, tough love. So that's my answer.
With the condition over in Europe, do you have any comments about what's going on there? A short answer would be good.
I'm shocked you asked. I'm going to give you a short answer, but we'll watch this unfold. There are parables. We don't want to be in a situation like Greece. We're headed that way if we're not careful. We don't want to be in a situation like Italy. Italy's an interesting place, by the way. The northern part of Italy is extremely prosperous. It's the Texas of that part of Europe, that and southern Germany. Just as we were late going into recession, first come out, just as we haven't suffered like everybody else, we've been blessed, even though we have a high unemployment rate. That's because so many people come here. We, by the way, here in Texas are so fortunate in that we're back roughly to the same employment levels that we were before the Great Recession started. Ourselves and I think North Dakota, which, forgive me, I think is the size of Denton County, have achieved those levels, maybe Alaska as well. But the parable is this: if you can't pay for the programs that you put together, you don't keep accumulating debt, you have to deal with them. And you have to be careful, because if they go too far, you're going to have social unrest. I mentioned the Tea Party, and I mentioned the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Dallas, Occupy whatever they occupy. Take them seriously. There are too many people out of work, too much unemployment, too much underemployment. And if we don't solve the problem of economic growth, if we don't take the fuel that we at the Federal Reserve have provided, which is, think of it as cheap, because money's almost interest cost free. It's abundant. Think of it as cheap premium fuel. We fill the gas tank. Someone's got to step on the gas pedal. Someone has to engage the transmission to drive the car of employment creation forward. That's not in my or my colleagues' power. That requires incentive. Who provides that incentive? The people that write the taxes and the tax laws and the regulation, and who decide how to allocate the money they take from us in order to improve our society. Until that is clarified, and remember, Congress hadn't even been able to agree a budget for 3 years, let alone pass a budget. Until that's agreed, and they provide the confidence going forward in the future, we're going to have uncertainty. Right now, forgive me, but we are the best looking horse in the glue factory, okay? So,
Why are you looking at me when you say that?
I was looking at this old horse over here. We see flows into dollars, keeping our interest rates low, which is a blessing. We're very, very lucky, but it's because we're less ugly than the rest. I just had a friend named Jürgen Stark, who's the German member of the Governing Council and Executive Committee of the European Central Bank. He's about to retire. He came and spent a couple of days with us. You know, we announced a program 2 days ago. But he was here in Dallas, one of the key architects on the European Central Bank side of that program. He reminded me that our debt burden is larger than that of Europe, our domestic debt burden. If you take all the European countries together, we're headed in the wrong direction. And if we don't bring it under control, we're going to have social unrest. We have to bring it under control. So that's what I draw from the European situation. And you will also note that central bankers are very deft at not answering questions that are asked.
I have one more question. I think it's very appropriate for all of us here. Is one of our audience said that I will be teaching a class, high school students, with a volunteer for junior achievement. What do you think I should discuss with them from personal finance from you today?
Well, I'm going to give a little ad for the Dallas Fed again. We have a publication called Building Wealth. It's used in the school system. It's used on the military bases. Chairman Bernanke and I were down at Fort Bliss the other day, and we went to a class where it was being taught basic things that people need to know. And you'd come down to, what does it mean to take out a loan? What's it going to cost you? What is compound interest? Why do you need to save? What virtues are there to being fiscally conservative, no matter what your political philosophy is? And I think that's the main thing. You have to pay for what you get. You pay through the sweat of your brow, or through the money you have in your pocket, or that you have access to in the credit lines. And one thing I hope you teach them is that you should never behave like Congress. Thank you very much. Is that okay?
Thank you, Mr. Fisher, and thanks everybody for attending.